Hey y'all, day 4 of the Christopher Wolfenbarger trial gave us a real tour of the justice system's greatest hits. Cold cases, dental records, saw marks on bones, and even a forensic dentist who casually dropped the line, "I'm the girl they call when DNA isn't good enough." Like, ma'am, that's both terrifying and fabulous. We had 6 big witnesses, and each one of them pulled us deeper into the forensic side of this case. Day 4 of the trial didn't ease us in. It went straight into the testimony lineup. First up was Pete Ricketts, a retired Atlanta police officer who once worked in the Crimes Against Children, Women, and Missing Persons Unit. His testimony framed the earliest police response to Melissa's disappearance, reminding the jury that this case was treated seriously from the beginning, even if it didn't always get answers. Next, the state called Sergeant Liane Lacosse, also retired from APD. Her testimony kept the focus on those first days of the investigation, adding to the picture of how Melissa's case was initially handled and documented. From there, the trial shifted into more forensic ground with Detective Richard Stein, who broke down the DNA testing that was attempted over the years. His testimony highlighted the frustrating reality that, despite repeated testing, no usable DNA evidence ever tied Christopher Wolfenbarger to Melissa's remains. And after Detective Stein, Detective Jarion Shephard from the Cold Case Unit took the stand. His testimony tried to connect the dots between Melissa's protective order in 1998, Christopher's shifting stories, and his behavior during his arrest years later. By the end of the day, the jury was neck deep in the science behind how Melissa's remains were processed and identified, unintended. And if you're wondering whether the prosecution managed to connect these forensic puzzle pieces back to Wolfenbarger himself, well, the answer is complicated. Let's break it all down. The day began with retired Atlanta police detective Pete Ricketts, a man who spent much of his career chasing missing persons and investigating crimes against women and children. Back in 2000, it was his turn to chase Melissa's trail. Ricketts walked the jury through his first moves. He started with Melissa's mother, Norma Patton, in January of 2000. She told him when she'd last seen her daughter and filled in details about Melissa's children. From there, Ricketts tried to reach Christopher's family. When he sat down with Chris's mother, Kathy Wolfenbarger, she was, let's just say, less than enthusiastic. He had to press hard to get even general information, and he noted in his report that she seemed reluctant to help. Not exactly the warm, "thank you for looking for my missing daughter-in-law" kind of response you'd expect. The same pattern kept repeating. Ricketts spoke with Chris's grandparents, but they couldn't give him an address, a phone number, nothing concrete to help locate Chris. It was like the family collectively shrugged their shoulders. Then, in September 2001, after nearly 18 months of chasing shadows, Ricketts finally sat down with Chris himself at the Henry County Police Department. Chris wasn't under arrest, just being questioned. And his story? He said Melissa had left around Christmas of 1998, but he saw her again months later, walking on Lee Street in Atlanta. He painted a picture of her looking strung out, maybe using drugs, maybe seeing a guy named Mike from the Waffle House where she'd worked. Now here's the jaw-dropper. By April 1999, Melissa's skull was already found in a trash bag in Atlanta. So unless Chris had the gift of ghost spotting, this sighting doesn't add up. It's one of those red flags that screams he's trying to create an alibi timeline. In 2003, after Melissa's remains were positively identified with dental records, Ricketts interviewed Chris again, this time at the Gwinnett County Jail with another detective present. Chris stuck to the same story, but the timeline had already collapsed under its own weight. Ricketts' biggest contribution, aside from his interviews, was getting Melissa's dental records entered into NCIC, the national database. That step eventually made it possible for Dr. Carol Terry to confirm Melissa's remains, turning the case from a missing person file into a homicide investigation. Following Ricketts, the jury heard from retired Atlanta Police Sergeant Liane Elizabeth Lacosse. With 30 years on the force, much of it leading the cold case unit, she added more context to how this case refused to stay buried. Back in 2003, she was called to a house where cadaver dogs were searching. It was tied to Melissa's case, but nothing turned up. The dogs didn't hit, and the search ended with yet another dead end. But more than a decade later, in 2015, Lacosse's phone rang again. Melissa's mother, Norma Patton, and her sister, Tina, came to her in frustration. No arrest, no justice, and too many years of waiting. They wanted someone to keep pushing. Lacosse reopened the file, noticed gaps in the lab reports, and requested missing documentation. She followed up on names Norma and Tina provided, including re-interviewing Diane Parrott, who had been talked to years earlier. Lacosse admitted nothing groundbreaking came from that. No new fingerprints, no smoking gun. But what stood out was how relentless Melissa's family was. Nearly 20 years later, they were still pounding on doors, still demanding someone look at this case. Her testimony underscored that the Wolfenbarger case wasn't forgotten, and it showed the jury that the Patton family never once let it go cold in their hearts, even when the system stalled. From there, the day continued with investigator Richard Stein, who now works with the Chattahoochee Hills Police Department, but used to be assistant chief investigator with the Fulton County DA's office. Back in 2021, he was part of a newly formed capital and cold case division under DA Fonnie Willis. Stein explained how the unit came to life. Basically, everyone from the old administration had to reapply, and he snagged a spot in the new cold case team. Their mission was clear: breathe life into old files that had fallen into limbo. They got referrals from police agencies across Fulton County, Atlanta PD, Roswell, you name it, and then began sifting through which cases had living witnesses, which had usable evidence, and which had a shot at trial. That's how Melissa Wolfenbarger's case landed back on his desk. Stein testified that her parents came in, they visited the crime scene with cadaver dogs, and then started pulling threads from APD's files. They put together a whole checklist: who was still alive to testify, what physical evidence remained, and what could be sent for testing. Stein said they tried cutting-edge DNA analysis on the trash bags where Melissa's remains were found. The focus? The knots. If someone tied those plastic bags, there might still be touch DNA trapped in the knot fibers. Unfortunately, the testing came back inconclusive. Stein admitted it didn't hold evidentiary value, but it showed the state was still actively working the case even decades later. On cross-examination, the defense got him to confirm that TV crews and podcasters were present when they revisited the dump site years later, which, let's be honest, doesn't exactly scream controlled forensic integrity. Still, Stein held firm that the cold case unit took Melissa's file seriously and tried to wring every last piece of evidence they could out of it. Now let's talk about the state's 17th witness, Detective Jarion Shephard. He wasn't around in the 90s when all of this originally went down. He joined the Atlanta Police Department's cold case unit in 2020, picking up this file in 2021, more than 2 decades after Melissa disappeared. Shephard told the jury that when he dug into the old files, one of the first things that stood out to him was the 1998 Temporary Protective Order, TPO, that Melissa had taken out against Christopher. He framed it as a clear sign of abuse, a landmark moment in their relationship that documented violence. But on cross-examination, the defense pointed out that Shephard never actually talked to the original responding officer or the witnesses from that night. He just relied on the paperwork. And that paperwork doesn't always line up with live testimony. For example, Officer Sutton, the guy who responded back in '98, testified earlier in this trial that he didn't see any bruises on Melissa's back. That's a pretty big detail. Shephard admitted he hadn't spoken to Sutton and instead leaned only on what was written in the police reports. The defense pounced on that, saying, "Hey, the truth is supposed to stay consistent, but you're ignoring inconsistencies between reports and testimony." Shephard also talked about his interviews with Christopher himself, the first one happening in May of 2021. He emphasized that Chris gave conflicting stories about the last time he saw Melissa alive. In one version, Chris said it was December of '98, when she supposedly just walked away. In another version, years later, in a tape-recorded interview with Calhoun, Chris said it was March or April of 1999, right around the time her remains were found. Shephard called those inconsistencies a red flag, saying only lies change over time, not the truth. The defense pushed back hard. 18 years passed between those interviews. Are you really saying you'd expect someone to remember exact dates perfectly? After nearly 2 decades? Shephard doubled down, saying memory shouldn't shift if it's the truth. Another big point from Shephard was how Christopher responded when it finally came time to arrest him. According to Shephard, Chris hid in a makeshift cupboard behind an appliance in his home, forcing a fugitive team with about 30 armed officers in tactile gear to spend half an hour rooting him out. To Shephard, that looked like someone actively avoiding capture. But the defense reminded the jury of all the times over the years when Chris had voluntarily sat down with investigators, given DNA samples, even turned over hair for testing. They argued hiding during the arrest was inconsistent with decades of cooperation. Speaking of evidence, Shephard admitted that none of the physical evidence tied Chris directly to Melissa's murder. The pubic hair collected back in the day didn't match him. The DNA tests on the bags came back negative for him. Paint chips found with Melissa's remains didn't match anything in his house. And when cadaver dogs were used, they found nothing tying Melissa's death to Chris's property. Shephard's response? Time and weather had degraded everything. He painted the evidence like a soup. Melissa's remains had sat in plastic bags, exposed to rain, heat, and Georgia weather, which meant DNA was almost guaranteed to be compromised. Finally, Shephard underscored the custody situation with Melissa's kids. After the TPO was dismissed, the kids ended up with Chris's mother, Kathy Wolfenbarger. To Shephard, that made Melissa's ability to leave the relationship nearly impossible, because, as he put it, it's pretty odd for a mother to give up her children. He suggested that Melissa was trapped, with her abuser's family holding custody of her kids, leaving her with little choice. In the end, Shephard was a complicated witness. He didn't bring the kind of smoking gun forensic evidence the jury might have wanted. No DNA, no murder weapon, no definitive crime scene. But he did deliver a narrative that Chris had a history of violence, gave conflicting stories about Melissa's disappearance, and ultimately tried to evade justice. Whether that sticks with the jury is another story, because the defense definitely poked holes in the fact that so much of Shephard's case was built on paperwork, assumptions, and degraded evidence. Next up was Dr. Mary Beth Hauptle, testifying by Zoom from Florida. She's retired now, but back in 1999, she was a medico-legal investigator and forensic odontologist with the Fulton County Medical Examiner's Office. Dr. Hauptle told jurors that she was literally the one who took the original phone call when Melissa's skull was found by the roadside in April 1999. She and the ME at the time, Dr. Robert Parker, went to the scene, which was swarming with APD, GBI, and even investigators from Twiggs County. Why Twiggs County? Because they had a headless corpse on their hands and thought this might be their missing head. Yeah, that's the level of nightmare we're working with here. She described the skull's condition as green and badly decomposed, saying that the black plastic bag had basically cooked the remains. Not recent, not fresh. This had been sitting for a while. She took photos, logged evidence, and then brought it back to the ME's office to process. But Hauptle's main contribution was identification. As a forensic dentist, she charted the skull's teeth and compared them to dental records from Melissa's dentist, Dr. Brantley. The key? A single silver amalgam filling on tooth number 31. That filling was unique, and it matched Melissa's dental chart exactly. She testified that with scientific certainty, she identified the skull as Melissa Wolfenbarger's. On cross, the defense poked at the dental records. They pointed out she had noted cavities in other teeth, but hadn't highlighted them as much as the filling. They also hammered on the timeline. It wasn't until 2003, 4 years after the skull was discovered, that the ID was officially confirmed. Hauptle didn't dispute that, but she stood by her work. The filling was Melissa's, and that skull belonged to her. Closing out day 4 was Dr. Mark Guilbeau, now with Clayton County, but back then a forensic anthropologist with Fulton. If Hauptle was the dentist, Guilbeau was the bone guy, and not just any bone guy. He literally wrote his master's thesis on saw marks in bone. He testified that Melissa's remains actually had 2 separate case files, one for the skull found in April 1999, another for the extremities found in June 1999. From the start, investigators believed they belonged to the same person, but the system kept them under different numbers. Guilbeau explained how he examined the skull after autopsy prep. He even had to reconstruct the cranium with wax because the top had been cut away during autopsy. Using standard anthropological measurements, he ran the skull through the Giles and Elliott discriminant function formula. The result? It classified the skull as a white male. Yikes! That mistake meant early investigators were looking for missing men, not Melissa. Guilbeau admitted on the stand that the formula isn't foolproof. Sometimes females fall into the male range, especially when the skull is altered or incomplete. Still, he conceded it was a misstep that delayed the ID. But his most powerful testimony came when the state showed him autopsy photos of Melissa's vertebrae and long bones. He pointed out clear saw striations, parallel grooves consistent with mechanical sawing. Some bones had partial cuts that snapped, others were cleanly severed. When the prosecutor showed him a photo of a saw similar to the one investigators believed was used, he confirmed, yes, that's the type of tool that could have made those marks. On cross, the defense seized on the misclassification, pressing him on how long it took to correct the ID. They also asked why DNA preservation wasn't prioritized before cleaning the skull with bleach. Guilbeau admitted it would have been the prudent thing to do, but back then his focus was skeletal analysis, not tissue. In hindsight, yeah, DNA should have come first. On redirect, the state reminded jurors of the context. Another case at the time involved a headless male body in Macon. When Melissa's skull showed up the next day, investigators jumped to conclusions, thinking it belonged to the corpse. Combined with the male classification, it misdirected things early on. Day 4 was a jam-packed day in court, and it ran the full spectrum, from retired cops revisiting the past to cold case detectives sparring with defense, and finally, the medical experts laying out the grim reality of the evidence. We opened with Pete Ricketts, a retired Atlanta PD investigator who worked in crimes against children, women, and missing persons. He reminded everyone how this case first entered law enforcement's radar, those early missing persons angles that eventually turned into something much darker. Next up was Sergeant Liane Lacosse, also retired from Atlanta PD, who backed up the picture of those early days. Her testimony added to the procedural backbone, showing what police did and sometimes didn't do back when Melissa first vanished. Then came Captain Richard Stein, the DNA and forensics expert. He calmly explained the testing, the findings, and the frustrating limitations of dealing with old, degraded evidence. The jury got a crash course in how science can help or sometimes fail in a decades-old homicide. The spotlight then shifted to Detective Jarion, Shephard of the APD Cold Case Unit. His testimony was tense. The state leaned on him to highlight inconsistencies in Christopher Wolfenbarger's statements and suspicious behavior, like hiding during his arrest. The defense, however, pounced on his reliance on second-hand reports and his framing of inconsistencies as lies instead of memory lapses. Shephard was one of the more combative witnesses we've seen so far. The day closed with two medical experts who grounded everything in hard science and procedure. Dr. Mary Beth Hauptle, a retired medical legal death investigator, focused on chain of custody and proper documentation, reminding the jury that without strict procedure, cases like this can unravel. Following her, Dr. Mark Guilbeau, a senior examiner with Clayton County Medical Examiner's Office and formerly with Fulton County. He walked through the grim conditions of Melissa's remains. His testimony hammered home just how much decomposition, environment, and time complicated any chance of drawing clear conclusions. By the end of day 4, the jury had been taken on a full journey from the very first missing persons investigation through the science of forensics into the fiery debate of a cold case detective and finally to the stark realities of medical evidence. It wasn't about one big revelation, it was about the accumulation of details, each piece stacking onto the next. The message from day 4, this case is built on layers: law enforcement procedure, forensic science, and human testimony, all colliding against the ticking clock of 25 years. For the jury, the challenge now is deciding what still matters through all that time and what may have been lost forever. And that's it for this recap. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching and supporting me. Be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and click the bell so you don't miss any of my recaps. And remember, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, y'all.